So in this video, we're finishing our survey of animal adaptations by looking at vertebrates that were able to live further and further on land. So we kind of, in the last video, talked about an ancestor that was able to get on land, but maybe them and modern amphibians were kind of restricted as to where they could live. They could generally only live in very warm, wet places. And we'll see that maybe the first of those barriers that was to break is that restriction of having to live in wet places. And we'll see that some adaptations enabled future ancestors to live in drier places. So let's talk about those adaptations. First of all, just some kind of barrier on the surface of the body to water loss. So if you actually remember, salamanders and frogs kind of have wet skin because they actually use that along with lungs to breathe and get oxygen to their blood. But mammals, birds, and reptiles are all going to kind of just use lungs exclusively, and their skin is going to be not wet, but have some kind of scale or watertight skin or feathers that all kind of work to really block water loss from the inside of the body. So very similar to the plant cuticle, very similar to the arthropod exoskeleton is as sort of an idea. But remember that one of the other reasons that amphibians have to live near water is because they reproduce in water. Remember that these are little frog eggs that aren't very big because they can just use the water around them to support the growing organism. And so the amniotic egg is going to be the reproductive solution to not having to live near water. And the amniotic egg is basically just a larger egg that kind of, first of all, has its own water inside of it. These are snake eggs. Here's snake mom, I guess, guarding them. Here is actually, we mammals are considered amniotes as well. We just have an internal egg that we kind of keep inside until the organism is ready to be born in kind of a live birth. So this is actually like a little cat fetus that was sort of taken out somehow. But you can really see that kind of membrane around the developing organism. And as it turns out, this sort of egg structure has a lot of the same structures that reptile and bird eggs have, just not the hard shell, obviously. And so the amniotic egg allows to have kind of enough water inside to support the growing organism and some kind of barrier that also slows water loss if you're talking about an external egg. And so you're able to survive yourself in the adult body without losing too much water, and you can reproduce offspring where they can develop without losing too much water. And so with those two major innovations, we're able to see reptiles and birds and mammals that are able to live away from wet places. So let's go ahead and talk about the reptiles first. You'll see that I actually called them non-bird reptiles here because kind of in our old system, reptiles and birds were separate classes. But kind of in modern classification, a lot of scientists are pushing us to put birds within the reptile group. So I'm kind of splitting the difference here. But usually when we refer to reptiles, you guys know of lizards and snakes, right? So those are your classic kind of reptiles. They can live in wet or dry places. Think about that you can find snakes in desert climates, for example. But we're still going to see that they're kind of restricted to living in warm places. And so as it turns out, that's because reptiles and actually the amphibians before them are both ectotherms, and that's going to require them to live in warm places. So let's talk about that term ectothermy, and then we'll see how mammals and birds are a little different. So ectothermy, ecto kind of means outside. They use outside factors to control their body temperature or therm. And so if a lizard's too cold, it has to kind of just go out into the sun and sun itself in order to warm itself up. If it gets too hot, it can go back into the shade or kind of dip into some water to cool itself off, but it can't do anything internally to cool down or warm up. Now, as it turns out, that actually has its pluses and minuses. So as I was kind of commenting, a minus of that is in a really cold place, a lizard or a snake just might not be able to warm itself up enough to be active or survive. And so that's why we don't see snakes kind of in like a snowy forest or in the tundra or anything like that. They can't live in cold climates, but a plus, an advantage, is that they don't spend as many calories kind of as a similarly sized mammal or bird does. So it's kind of less expensive. For example, I have some colleagues who have pythons, and they don't need to feed those pythons maybe feeder mice. They only do that maybe every 2 weeks, 3 weeks sometimes. And so they definitely do not have to feed their pet every single day like you do if you're a cat or a dog owner, for example. So less expensive, but also kind of less flexible as to what kind of habitats you can live in. So if we now kind of talk about the final major adaptation that enables birds and mammals to live in colder places, it's going to be endothermy as sort of a contrast to ectothermy. Now, as it turns out, we have a lot of other evidence to suggest that mammals and birds kind of evolved from very different reptile ancestors. And so we actually think that the endothermy trait kind of evolved independently in the two lineages, or maybe that's kind of another example of that idea of convergent evolution. So they're both endotherms, and remember that that means that they can use their internal mechanisms to control their body temperature. Since we humans are mammals, and since we're endotherms as well, just kind of think about yourself here. If you get too hot, your body might kind of release water to make you sweat, and that will help cool you down. Or if you're really cold, you might contract your muscles and shiver to warm yourself up. So you can do things internally. Certainly you can still go into the sun or the shade as well, but you also have internal ways of keeping your body temperature right. And again, just to kind of, it's really the opposite of our discussion with ectothermy, but that potentially allows certain mammal species to live in colder places. That wouldn't include us necessarily. Since we've reduced our fur or hair so much on our bodies, we've kind of adapted for a more warmer climate. Human ancestral remains have been found mostly in the savannas of Africa, for example. But at least some other mammal species, like if you imagine, wolves in a snowy forest or owls in a snowy forest, have adapted to be able to live in the cold. So it allows for a greater range of territory colonizing on land, but it is more expensive, as I was kind of saying, the opposite of reptiles. So birds and mammals have to eat to find those calories in order to support that more expensive body plan. Okay, so let's just kind of finish this video by just kind of talking about birds and mammals. Birds are generally adapted for flight, although some interesting birds, like penguins, for example, have kind of lost that ability in more recent evolutionary history as they've adapted to their current environment. So in the Antarctic, it isn't really all that useful to fly. They dive into the water to find their food. But other bird species certainly can fly, and just how have they adapted to do that? Generally, they've reduced a lot of weight to be able to use their muscles to be able to fly. So usually much shorter legs or kind of thinner legs, no teeth. They just have beak to be able to start to eat food, and then they have kind of internal digestive mechanisms to grind it up. And their bones are hollow, as it turns out, as compared to ours. So just lots of different ways to drop their body weight in order to be able to support flight. Okay, and then if we were to jump over to mammals, what are some interesting traits that we should think about in terms of mammals? So mammals are kind of characterized by having hair or fur of some kind. Mammals also have larger brains than many of the other vertebrate groups, and so that maybe gives us more intelligence to be able to learn by experience. And modify our behavior rather than just behave by sheer instinct alone like other species do. Maybe that larger brain size can also help for more sophisticated communication, if you think about a wolf pack kind of hunting down a prey together. And then mammary glands to produce milk is also characteristic of mammals. And so what's the purpose of that milk? Well, broadly, what I'd have you think about is that with larger brain size also comes a longer developmental time for newborns. And so maybe that very nutrient-rich milk kind of supports that early development, that early growth, and that early setting up of the brain so that mammal can function. Think especially about human infants. As humans, we have even larger brains than typical mammals. And think about how helpless that newborn infant is after birth. So they even spend about 9 months inside of mom for a while, but they still need that extra support, that extra care, that extra time for the brain to set itself up before that new human offspring is ready to function on their own. Okay, so what we've really done here in this video is kind of cover the last vertebrate groups, but we've also told this gradual story of how new vertebrate groups were able to colonize further and further on land. The transition to dry and wet places that reptiles first kind of trailblazed, and then mammals and birds being able to live anywhere, including cold places.